And also, I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, did you say in your book that this early caliphate movement in India, for example, had non-Muslim allies, like even some Hindus, like Gandhi? Was Gandhi somehow an ally to this restoration of the Ottoman Caliphate? And if that is the case, why on earth would Gandhi be interested in that political restoration of the Islamic Caliphate in Istanbul? What's going on there, do you think?
A great question. So let me get into this case study. So this is an example that goes back exactly a century ago. So interestingly, Paul, 2024 was the 100th year anniversary of the fall of what for some people is the Ottoman Caliphate, whether it's the Ottoman state. But some notion of the Muslim Caliphate, the end of that happened exactly 100 years ago, and the formation of the Turkish Republic. So exactly 100 years ago, this debate gets precipitated in South Asia, really intense, but also very productive and interesting debate, again on the question of Hindu-Muslim friendship. And there was this movement that emerged called the Caliphate movement or the Khilafat movement that, as you correctly pointed out, collaborated with Gandhi and the Indian National Congress at a moment when Gandhi himself was leading a movement called the non-cooperation movement. And the whole idea was that we ought to cut our civic ties with the British colonial government, and hence we will not cooperate with that government in any kind of domains of politics or other sort of domains of life having to do with, for example, taking funding for schools and colleges and so on. So there was an alliance between the Muslim leaders of the Khilafat movement that included some of the most prominent Muslim scholars, both those who were seminary trained, called the Muslim ulama or the traditionalists, and also some of the Muslim modernists who got training or were educated at Western institutions of learning. And the key question here was, or the key sort of argument that the Khilafat movement leaders made was that in allying with Gandhi and establishing Hindu-Muslim political collaboration and a certain degree of Muslim-Hindu friendship through political collaboration, we will be able to take on the British colonial state and hence salvage the caliphate, which is a very important institution and which is the fulcrum of Muslim political life. Yeah. And their main argument was that in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty in South Asia itself, the caliphate is the closest bet in terms of the resuscitation of some notion of Muslim political sovereignty. Right. And the interesting thing there, Paul, is that for these Khilafat movement leaders, they did not make this argument for Hindu-Muslim friendship by making some kind of recourse to a liberal secular narrative of saying, oh, no, let's be good with non-Muslims. That is what the liberal thing to do is. But rather, their argument was centered on a particular reading of Islamic law, on a particular reading of the Sharia. And their main argument actually came from the Quran, whereby they cited these two very interesting verses in the Quran, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 60, called Surah Mumtahana, or the Woman Examined. And these two verses basically say that Muslims can engage in relations of friendship and goodness with those non-Muslims who don't fight you because of your faith, who don't aid others in fighting you, and who don't drive you out of your homes or aid others in driving you out of your homes. In other words, those non-Muslims who are not aggressive towards you, those non-Muslims who are not violent towards you, you can turn to them in friendship. And then the next verse basically says that you are not allowed to engage in friendship with only those non-Muslims who do these things, fight you because of your faith, throw you out of your homes, or aid others in throwing you out. So the argument of the Khilafat movement leaders, like this very famous scholar called Abul Kalam Azad, who actually became the education minister of independent India after independence and was the youngest president of the Congress party of Gandhi. So his main argument was that in South Asia, the non-Muslims of the first variety, those who don't fight you in religion, are the Hindus. And then those who fight you in religion are the British, because they have colonizing designs over the Ottoman Caliphate. So it was these specific verses of the Quran through which he made a very legal and Muslim theological argument for why this kind of interreligious friendship is not only permissible, but in fact is the need of the hour. So the point I really want to emphasize here is that for someone like Abul Kalam Azad, if you look at him today and say, oh, here is the good Muslim who wants friendship with the non-Muslims, he in fact is not making his argument from some kind of liberal secular discourse of being friends with the non-Muslim is a good thing, but rather through a specific reading of the Islamic legal tradition. And in fact, the same scholar then argued that it is an individual obligation, the category in Islamic law which is called Fard Ain, an individual obligation for every Indian Muslims to take up arms and engage in jihad against the British state. So here you have a Muslim scholar who today, for example, in contemporary India and elsewhere is oftentimes heralded as this great liberal champion of interreligious friendship and so on. If you look at his writings, he in fact is calling for jihad against the British and actual violence. So again, this is one example of a complex figure who does not really fit into some kind of a binary between the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, or the liberal and the conservative, and so on. Now, the opposing viewpoint, very briefly, I'll give you the opposing viewpoint to this argument to further punctuate this larger kind of case study. So the opposing argument came from many Muslim scholars, but perhaps the most prominent was this scholar called Ahmad Raza Khan, who died in 1921. And he is the founder of the Barelvi school in South Asia, which to this day is perhaps the most widely followed normative sort of orientation in South Asia, and of course has massive following even among diaspora communities, for example, in the UK. There are many seminaries, for example, in the UK affiliated with the Barelvi school even today. So this scholar, Ahmad Raza Khan, because he's from the Barelvi school, which has very sophisticated arguments for why Muslims should celebrate the Prophet's birthday celebration, why Muslim saints should be taken seriously as charismatic figures. But because of these positions, he's oftentimes, and the school is oftentimes caricatured as the soft Islam, the kind of more porous Islam. But when you look at his discourses on Hindu-Muslim friendship, he in fact made the counter-argument. And his counter-argument was, okay, let's go back to those two verses in the Quran, verses 8 and 9 of Surah Mumtahana. And he says that, no, Hindus don't fit that category of non-Muslims who don't fight you because of your religion. And he proposes an experiment. He says, go to any town, go to any village and try sacrificing a cow and then see what happens to you. So it's very interesting, Paul, that now today we're living in, and we can talk more about the contemporary relevance of these intra-Muslim debates in a moment. But I just want to quickly, very briefly, sort of highlight and flag for your viewers that in today's India, for example, one of the major problems is this cow-related violence against Muslims and against Dalits by Hindu nationalists and their allies. So here is a Muslim scholar talking about this exactly a century ago. And his viewpoint was that, no, Hindus do fit into that category of non-Muslims who do fight you in terms of religion. And then he made the other very interesting argument that when it comes to engaging with the British, he makes this very subtle and interesting argument that you have to maintain what he called mere transactional relations, not substantive friendship, but mere transactional relations by taking funding for your schools, by gaining employment in their institutions and so on. And his counter argument was that Gandhi, by making an argument that Muslims should cut all civic ties with the British, no employment, no taking of funding and so on, that will in fact lead to the self-destruction of the Muslim community. Because already a beleaguered minority which has lost its political sovereignty, if they also lose jobs, if they also don't get funding for their schools, that will lead to the evisceration of that minority community even further. So he makes this distinction between substantive friendship and mere transactional relations. And finally, then he makes the argument that, okay, even if you go by the school or the official sort of tenets of British colonial rule, which talks about religious freedom, something like cow sacrifice is a very important part of our tradition. It is a very distinctive marker of Islam in South Asia. So by pressuring or coercing Muslims to cease this practice because of the sensitivities of the Hindu community, you, in fact, the British, would be undermining our religious freedom. So here you have a Muslim scholar who is steeped in traditional Islamic knowledge traditions, the Sharia. And he makes his arguments according to the Sharia. But he is also versatile and he's able to cite the doctrine of religious freedom coming from a colonial kind of set of categories. So you have the same Muslim scholar. He's not some kind of a, blind traditionalist who is...
He's doing ijtihad, this sense of independent reasoning, and he's taking into account context and new factors, colonialism in this case, and so on. So it's subtle, it's proactive, it's not slavishly following blindly a kind of tradition. And the what you're showing very, very fascinatingly here is the intra-Muslim dialogue, how to respond to this situation in the way that is faithful to the tradition. And there's a disagreement, actually. And one can't just cite the Quran, because that's the whole point. How does one apply the Quran in this circumstance, given the context, which is A, B, C, D, and E? So absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And interestingly, then the scholars on the Khilafat movement side, they in fact use the same idea of religious freedom. How do they use it? They say that, well, the Caliphate is a very sensitive part of Muslim theological, doctrines and Islamic law, and it's a necessity according to them. And so the British, by having these colonizing designs to destroy the Ottoman Caliphate, is intervening in a matter of religious sensitivity for Muslims. And that is, again, going against their own principle of religious freedom and secularism and so on. So here you have two groups of Muslim scholars, engaging in an intra-Muslim debate on how these two verses of the Quran should be understood, among many other things that I'm sort of leaving aside for purposes of brevity. But they are equally versatile and agile. And as you put it, they have this independent legal reasoning through which they can bring in categories from the colonial sort of discursive economy to make these very sophisticated arguments. Now, your comment just now, Paul, alerts me to another key aspect of this book, that this might be a good time to insert here. And we've had a WhatsApp conversation on this already, which is one of the other things that I'm really interested in this book, Perilous Intimacies, perhaps even much more deliberately than my first book, is that the Islamic legal tradition, what we today call the Sharia, and the laws that come from it and so on, it's very diverse. It has multiple opinions. It has all kinds of different disagreements and so on. But nonetheless, the formative period for the establishment of the Islamic legal tradition was a formative period that assumed politically Muslim empire. It has this kind of a background of Muslim imperial sovereignty. Now, of course, the logics of Muslim imperial sovereignty, they change from, the Umayyads to the Abbasids and others and so on. So I'm not trying to make some kind of an argument about some monolithic pre-modern Islam. But nonetheless, when it came to Islamic law, especially when it came to these questions like interreligious friendship, non-Muslim relations, for the jurists of the pre-modern period, those who were at the formative stage of this Islamic legal tradition, they assumed Muslim imperial sovereignty as their political context. And it is under that assumption, which of course is very common among most pre-modern empires, this desire for sovereign power over other communities. And it is under that assumption that they then formulated categories like, a protected non-Muslim, the dhimmi, or things like the aggressive non-Muslim, what is called the muharib, and so on. So these categories and these laws on Muslim, non-Muslim relations presumed a context of Muslim imperial sovereignty, of Muslim empire. So one of the questions I'm interested in this book is, and this is applicable to multiple contexts, not only South Asia, but perhaps most punctuated in South Asia, that as a community loses that context of Muslim imperial sovereignty with the end of the Mughal Empire, especially after the 1857 rebellion, which effectively inaugurated in full steam the colonial project. So in that moment, with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and with the loss of that background assumption, how then do Muslim scholars in South Asia from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century read, interpret, and engage with that tradition that had as its foundational assumption the context of Muslim empire? And my main argument is that these kinds of readings of the pre-modern tradition then are very subtle, very interesting, but then those readings have to also contend with a new set of conditions, a new set of categories, like religious freedom, the category of the secular, categories that come from the colonial discursive economy. And one of the things I'm most interested in is to look at the encounter, the interaction between that pre-modern Muslim legal tradition in a context which is no longer there with this discursive economy, the context of British colonial power. And one of my main arguments is that this encounter does not happen on even terms. This happens on very uneven terms. That in order for these Muslim scholars to have their arguments get a hearing, for example, at colonial courts, for example, in terms of colonial policies, with regards to which areas in South Asia will cow slaughter be permitted and which ones will not, they had to engage with this very uneven playing field, this very uneven terrain. But nonetheless, although this terrain is uneven, these scholars engaged with that uneven terrain in some very sophisticated and interesting ways. And regardless of what our viewpoint might be, it would be useful for us to understand these traditions of intra-Muslim debate on their own terms in order to understand our present better, to get a historical understanding of the past, which has made the current present and Muslim, non-Muslim relations in this present possible.